I never thought my marriage would be threatened by someone so familiar, so seemingly harmless. Someone I had welcomed into my life, into my home. But here I am, sitting in the wreckage of my own trust, staring at the pieces of a life that feels like it no longer belongs to me. It all started innocently enough. At least that's what I told myself at first. Ryan, my husband of 10 years, had reconnected with Amanda, his childhood best friend. They'd been inseparable growing up, he told me, sharing everything from their favorite books to their dreams of the future. Amanda had moved away after high school, and their lives had drifted apart as lives often do. But through the strange magic of social media, she had resurfaced. Ryan showed me her friend request with an eager smile, like a kid unearthing an old treasure. "Amanda!" he exclaimed, as if saying her name summoned her spirit into the room. "I can't believe it. I haven't talked to her in years." I smiled back, his enthusiasm infectious. "You should reconnect. It's always nice to catch up with old friends." First, it really was nice. Amanda seemed warm and genuine, her messages full of shared memories that made Ryan laugh out loud. He told me all about their childhood escapades, sneaking into the neighbor's garden to steal apples, building treehouses that collapsed under the weight of their dreams. I listened, happy to see him so animated, so alive. Life had become routine lately, and this spark of joy felt like a gift. Amanda and I even exchanged a few messages ourselves. She seemed lovely, and I liked the idea of getting to know someone who had meant so much to Ryan. When she suggested meeting up for lunch, I encouraged it. "You should go," I said, brushing a hand over his shoulder. "It's good for you to have your own friendships." The first time they met in person, I barely noticed. Ryan came home buzzing with excitement, recounting their hours-long conversation over coffee. I teased him about being so chatty and we laughed it off. I didn't see the harm in it, why would I? She was just an old friend. But soon there were more meetups, more messages, more late-night phone calls where his voice dropped to a low, intimate murmur. At first, I told myself it was still harmless. After all, they had years of catching up to do. Ryan was an affectionate, expressive man by nature, and I trusted him. Until the first crack appeared. It was a Saturday afternoon when I found the text. I wasn't snooping. I never felt the need to. But his phone buzzed on the counter, and the preview flashed across the screen. "I can't stop thinking about last night. Let's talk soon." My stomach clenched. I stared at the words, the casual intimacy of them, and felt something sharp lodge itself in my chest. When I finally unlocked his phone, trembling, the full conversation unraveled before me. The jokes, the flirty banter, the confessions of feelings that were too complicated to explain. Amanda wasn't just a friend. She wasn't just a memory from his past. She had become something much more dangerous. I confronted Ryan that night, my voice shaking with anger and disbelief. "What's going on between you and Amanda?" He looked at me like I'd slapped him. "Nothing," he said quickly, too quickly. "We're just friends, I swear. Friends don't say they can't stop thinking about each other." I shot back, holding up his phone like evidence in a trial. His face drained of color, but he didn't deny it. He couldn't. "She doesn't mean anything," he said, his voice pleading now. "It's just, I don't know. Nostalgia? She reminds me of who I used to be. But it's not what you think." I wanted to believe him. God, I wanted to believe him. But something in his eyes told me he wasn't being entirely truthful. And once trust is cracked, it's almost impossible to repair. Over the next few weeks, I tried to hold our marriage together. I tried to be understanding, to give him space to sort through his feelings. But Amanda's presence was a shadow over everything. I could feel her between us, in the silences that stretched too long, in the way his phone was always angled away from me now. I could feel her in the hollow ache in my chest every time he smiled at a message that wasn't from me. One night I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I went through his phone again, desperate for answers, for proof that I wasn't imagining things. What I found shattered me. Photos of them together, her head resting on his shoulder, their faces too close. Messages that spoke of a connection that wasn't just emotional. The words burned into my mind. "I wish I could see you again. I wish things were different." I confronted him again, and this time he didn't deny it. "I didn't mean for this to happen," he said, his voice raw with regret. "I didn't want to hurt you." "But you did," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. You've been hurting me this whole time. I wanted to scream, to throw things, to claw back the life I thought we had. But instead I just stood there, hollow and broken, as he begged for forgiveness. I don't know what will happen next. Part of me wants to fight for our marriage, to believe that we can rebuild. But another part of me wonders if it's already too late. Amanda wasn't just his childhood friend. She was a reminder of a life he wanted, a version of himself he missed. And I'm not sure if I can ever compete with that. In the days that followed, I lived in a haze of disbelief and quiet devastation. Every room in our house seemed smaller, the walls pressing in on me with memories that now felt tainted. The kitchen table where we'd shared 1,000 dinners, the couch where we'd curled up watching movies. Everything bore the ghost of what we used to be. And then there was Ryan, moving through our shared space like a man who didn't know where he belonged anymore. He tried to talk to me, to explain, but every time he opened his mouth, I felt the anger rise, hot and bitter in my throat. I didn't mean for it to get this far, he said one night, his voice cracking with exhaustion. You have to believe me. I love you, not her. I stared at him, my arms crossed tight over my chest like a shield. If you love me, I said slowly, then why was she the one you turned to? Why couldn't you talk to me instead of falling into whatever this is? He didn't have an answer. Or maybe he did, but he didn't know how to say it out loud. That hurt almost as much as the betrayal itself. For years I thought I knew him better than anyone. I thought we were partners, equals, that our love was unshakable. But now all I could see were the cracks, the little fractures that had been forming long before Amanda came back into his life. The truth was, part of me wanted to forgive him. I wanted to believe this was just a mistake, a momentary lapse that we could work through. But the other part of me, the part that felt like it had been gutted and left to bleed out, wasn't sure I could ever trust him again. And without trust, what was left? Amanda, of course, was silent throughout all of this. She didn't reach out to me, didn't try to explain or apologize. Maybe she thought it wasn't her place, or maybe she didn't care. Either way, her absence spoke volumes. She had inserted herself into my marriage, into my life, and then disappeared, leaving chaos in her wake. Ryan suggested counseling. He said it like a man offering a life raft in a storm, desperate for something, anything that might keep us afloat. I agreed, if only because I didn't know what else to do. The thought of walking away from a decade of love and commitment felt unbearable, even if staying meant confronting the mess we had become. Our first session was awkward, the air between us thick with unspoken resentment. The therapist, a kind-looking woman with sharp eyes, asked us to talk about why we were there. Ryan went first, stumbling through a halting explanation of his feelings, his guilt, his confusion. I sat there, my arms crossed again, biting back the urge to interrupt. When it was my turn, the words spilled out of me in a torrent of anger and pain. He didn't just betray me, I said, my voice shaking. He betrayed us. Our life. Everything we built together. And now he wants me to just... What? Pretend it didn't happen? Pretend she doesn't exist? Ryan flinched, but he didn't argue. Maybe he knew he had no right. The therapist nodded, her expression thoughtful. It's clear there's a lot of hurt here, she said gently. But if you're both willing to work through it, we can start by identifying what went wrong and how to rebuild trust. Trust. The word felt like a cruel joke. How do you rebuild something so fragile once it's been shattered? I wanted to believe it was possible. For all my anger, I still loved Ryan. That was the hardest part. The love didn't just disappear, even when it felt like it should. It lingered, stubborn and aching, refusing to let go. But rebuilding wasn't easy. The therapy sessions forced us to confront things we'd both been avoiding for years. Ryan admitted he'd felt restless, like he was losing himself in the monotony of our day-to-day life. He said Amanda had reminded him of who he used to be, a version of himself he thought he'd lost. Hearing that hurt more than I expected. It wasn't just about her. It was about the life we'd built together. A life I thought had made him happy. I had my own confessions to make. I admitted that I'd taken him for granted, that I'd stopped seeing him as a person with his own needs and dreams. I admitted that I'd let the spark between us fade, assuming it would always be there, even without effort. Saying those things out loud felt like cutting myself open, but it also felt freeing in a way. Like I was finally facing the truth. For a while it seemed like we were making progress. Ryan stopped talking to Amanda completely. deleting her number and blocking her on every platform. He became more present, more attentive, like he was trying to make up for lost time. And I tried to. I tried to forgive, to let go of the bitterness that had taken root in my heart. We started going on dates again, rediscovering the parts of each other that had been buried under years of routine. But no matter how hard I tried, the doubt lingered. Every time his phone buzzed, my stomach clenched. Every time he came home late, my mind raced with worst-case scenarios. I hated feeling that way, hated what it said about me, about us. But trust doesn't come back overnight. Sometimes I wondered if it would come back at all. One night, months after everything had come to light, I found myself lying awake, staring at the ceiling while Ryan slept beside me. I thought about Amanda, about the version of Ryan she brought out, the version I hadn't seen in years. I thought about our marriage, about whether it was worth saving, about whether it could be saved. And then I thought about myself, about the woman I used to be before all of this, before the betrayal and the doubt and the pain. I thought about what I wanted, what I deserved. In that quiet moment, I realized I didn't have the answers. Maybe I never would. But I knew one thing for certain. Whatever happened next, I couldn't keep living in the shadow of what had been. I had to choose a path forward, whether it was with Ryan or without him. And for the first time in months, I felt a glimmer of hope. Not for us necessarily, but for me. For the woman I was becoming. Forged in the fire of heartbreak, stronger than I ever thought I could be. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, yet the heaviness in my chest never fully lifted. Even as Ryan and I went through the motions of repairing what had been broken, I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted. I wanted to believe we could fix it, that love could conquer betrayal if we worked hard enough, if we wanted it badly enough. But love wasn't the problem. I still loved him maddeningly despite everything. What I didn't know was if I could ever feel safe with him again. Our lives had settled into a fragile routine. We went to counseling once a week, delving into the messy, uncomfortable truths about our relationship. I learned to bite back the snide remarks that rose unbidden when the topic of Amanda inevitably came up, and he learned to listen without becoming defensive. On the surface, it seemed like progress. But underneath, I felt like I was walking on a tightrope, one misstep away from plummeting into the abyss. Ryan, to his credit, was trying. He'd become hyper-aware of his actions, going out of his way to be transparent and accountable. He shared his schedule down to the minute, let me read his messages, and always answered my calls no matter what he was doing. First, this constant reassurance helped. But as time went on, it started to feel like a bandage on a wound that refused to heal. The problem wasn't just his behavior. It was the nagging voice in my head that kept asking, what if? What if he wasn't telling me everything? What if I missed something? What if it happened again? One evening, I found myself alone in the kitchen, staring at the clock as the minutes ticked by. Ryan had texted to say he'd be late coming home, something about a work meeting running over. It was perfectly plausible, perfectly innocent. But my mind didn't see it that way. Instead, it conjured images of him and Amanda in some quiet corner, their heads bent close together, laughing at a joke only they understood. I hated myself for thinking that way, for letting my imagination run wild. But the thoughts wouldn't stop. They swirled around me, suffocating and relentless. By the time Ryan walked through the door, I was seething, though I couldn't even pinpoint why. "You're late," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. He looked at me, his face weary but patient. "I told you I had a meeting." "I know," I snapped. "But it doesn't take 2 hours to wrap up a meeting, Ryan." His brow furrowed, and I could see the frustration simmering beneath the surface. "What do you want me to say?" "I was at work." "That's it." "Is it?" I shot back, crossing my arms. "Because sometimes it feels like there's always something you're not telling me." His patience snapped. "I can't keep doing this, Emily," he said, his voice rising. "I've done everything you've asked. I've been honest. I've been open. And it's still not enough for you. What more do you want?" The question hung in the air, heavy and accusing. I didn't have an answer, not one I could articulate. I wanted to scream that I wanted my old life back. The life where I didn't have to question him, where I didn't feel like a paranoid shell of myself. But that life was gone, and no amount of effort could bring it back. Instead of answering, I turned away, my arms tightening around myself. "I don't know," I whispered. "I don't know what I want anymore." Ryan sighed, the sound full of exhaustion and something that felt uncomfortably like resignation. Maybe that's the problem, he said quietly. Maybe neither of us knows. After that night, a strange silence fell over our house. We still talked, still went to counseling, still tried to piece together what was left of our marriage. But the conversations felt hollow, like we were going through the motions without truly believing in them. The weight of everything unsaid pressed down on us, growing heavier with each passing day. And then one afternoon Amanda's name came up again. Not from Ryan, but from someone I least expected. I was at the grocery store, distractedly scanning the shelves for a brand of coffee Ryan liked, when I ran into an old acquaintance, Lisa. We exchanged pleasantries, and I was about to move on when she said something that stopped me cold. "I saw Ryan the other day," she said casually. "At that little cafe on Main Street. He was with Amanda, wasn't he? She looks so different now." I almost didn't recognize her. The words hit me like a slap. My mind raced, trying to process what she'd said. "When was this?" I asked, my voice carefully controlled. "Oh, just last week," Lisa replied, oblivious to the storm brewing inside me. They looked like they were having a good time. It's nice that they stayed friends after all these years. I forced a smile, muttered something polite, and hurried out of the store. My hands were shaking as I gripped the steering wheel, my thoughts a chaotic mess. Had Ryan lied to me? Had he been seeing Amanda behind my back? Even after everything we'd been through? The possibility felt like a knife twisting in my gut. By the time I got home, my anger had reached a boiling point. Ryan was in the living room scrolling through his phone, completely unaware of the turmoil he just walked into. "Were you with Amanda last week?" I demanded, my voice trembling with fury. His head snapped up, his eyes wide with surprise. "What? No. Why would you think that?" "Lisa saw you," I said, my voice rising. "She saw you at a cafe with her. Don't lie to me, Ryan." He stood up, his expression shifting from surprise to indignation. "I wasn't with Amanda," he said firmly. "I haven't seen her since I blocked her. You know that." "Doi," I shot back. "Because apparently, everyone else knows more about your life than I do." His jaw tightened, and for a moment, he just stared at me, his frustration palpable. "I don't know what Lisa thinks she saw," he said finally, his voice low and controlled. "But it wasn't me. You can believe that or not, but I'm done defending myself for things I didn't do." I wanted to believe him. God, I wanted to believe him so badly. But the doubt was a living thing now, a parasite that refused to let go. And as I stood there, staring at the man I once thought I knew better than anyone, I realized something that terrified me. I didn't know if I could ever believe him again. The doubt gnawed at me like a slow poison, spreading through every corner of my mind until I couldn't tell the difference between my fears and reality. Ryan's denial should have been enough. He had looked me in the eye and told me he hadn't seen Amanda. But Lisa's words wouldn't stop echoing in my head, their weight growing heavier each time I replayed them. The image of Ryan sitting in that cafe with Amanda became a vivid, tormenting picture that I couldn't escape. I started noticing things I hadn't before, or maybe things I'd always noticed but had never questioned. The way Ryan kept his phone close even when he was at home. The occasional lapses in his schedule, moments where his explanations felt just a little too convenient. A few months ago I would have shrugged those things off. Now they felt like pieces of a puzzle I was desperate to solve. One night, I decided I couldn't live in this uncertainty any longer. After Ryan had fallen asleep, his quiet breathing filling the room, I reached for his phone on the nightstand. My hands were shaking so badly that I nearly dropped it. I felt a pang of guilt as I entered the passcode, but it was drowned out by the pounding of my heart. I told myself I had a right to know the truth, even if it meant breaking his trust in a way he'd broken mine. The messages were mundane at first, work emails, group chats with his friends, nothing unusual. But as I scrolled further, I found a conversation that froze me in place. It wasn't Amanda this time. It was one of his coworkers, a woman named Holly. The texts weren't overtly inappropriate, but there was a familiarity in their tone that set my teeth on edge. Jokes that seemed a little too personal. A photo she'd sent of herself at a happy hour, her smile wide and flirtatious. And then Ryan's response. "You look great. Wish I could have been there." My stomach churned. Was this how it had started with Amanda? A series of harmless exchanges that slowly crossed the line into something more? I didn't know what to think anymore. Every interaction, every word, felt like it had the potential to be a betrayal. The next morning I confronted him. I didn't wait for the coffee to brew or for him to fully wake up. The anger had been simmering all night, and now it was ready to boil over. "Who's Holly?" I asked, my voice sharp enough to cut. Ryan blinked at me, confused. "What?" "Holly," I repeated, holding up his phone. "Your coworker. The one you're texting about how great she looks." His face went pale, and I saw the exact moment he realized I'd gone through his messages. "Emily," he began, his voice calm, placating. "It's not what you think." "Don't," I snapped, cutting him off. "Don't tell me it's not what I think. Because I've heard that before. First it was Amanda, and now it's Holly. How many other women are there, Ryan? How many times am I supposed to believe you?" His expression shifted, frustration flashing in his eyes. "There's nothing going on with Holly," he said firmly. "She's just a coworker. We joke around, but that's it. I would never." "Stop," I said, my voice breaking. "Just stop. I can't keep doing this. I can't keep wondering if every woman you talk to is someone you're going to replace me with." Ryan ran a hand through his hair, his shoulders sagging. "Emily, I'm not trying to replace you. I don't want anyone else. I want us. But you have to trust me." "Trust you?" I laughed bitterly, the sound hollow even to my own ears. "How am I supposed to trust you when you've already broken it? How am I supposed to believe you when I don't even know who you are anymore?" He looked at me then, his eyes filled with a sadness that made my chest ache. "I don't know what else to do," he said quietly. "I've done everything I can to prove I'm not lying, but it's like you've already decided I'm guilty." "Because you are," I shot back. "You might not see it that way, but you let someone else into our marriage. You let her take what was supposed to be ours, and now I'm the one paying the price." The argument left us both drained, and by the end of it, nothing had been resolved. Ryan left for work without another word, and I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the untouched coffee growing cold in front of me. I didn't know what hurt more. His insistence that nothing was going on, or the fact that I couldn't bring myself to believe him. That night, I didn't wait for him to come home. I grabbed my keys and drove aimlessly, the city lights blurring as tears filled my eyes. I ended up at a park we used to visit when we were first dating, back when everything felt simple and certain. I sat on a bench, the cool air biting at my skin, and thought about the life we'd built together. I thought about the vows we'd made, the promises we'd broken, the love that had once felt unshakable. And I wondered if it was enough. If love was enough to overcome the doubt, the hurt, the fear. Or if some wounds were simply too deep to heal. When I finally returned home, Ryan was waiting for me. He didn't say anything, just looked at me with an expression that was equal parts relief and despair. I knew he wanted to fix this. I knew he wanted us to go back to the way we were. But I also knew that wasn't possible. "Emily," he began, his voice hesitant. "I don't know how to make this better, but I need you to tell me what you want. Do you want me to leave? Do you want us to keep trying? I'll do whatever you need, but I can't keep guessing." His words hung in the air, and for the first time in months, I realized I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that I couldn't keep living in this limbo, caught between the past and the future, between love and betrayal. I had to make a choice, and no matter what I chose, nothing would ever be the same again. The days that followed were some of the hardest I've ever endured. Ryan and I avoided each other more than we spoke, the air between us thick with tension. It wasn't the kind of angry silence that comes from a fight, the kind that eventually fades with time and effort. No, this was something heavier, more final, like we were both standing at the edge of a cliff, waiting for the other to take the first step into the abyss. I spent my nights replaying our conversations in my head, analyzing every word, every pause, every shift in his tone. During the day, I moved through life like a ghost, going to work, running errands, keeping up appearances, but all the while my mind was elsewhere. I couldn't escape the feeling that my marriage was unraveling, one thread at a time, and I was powerless to stop it. Ryan, for his part, tried to act as though nothing had changed. He brought me coffee in the mornings, offered to help with chores around the house, even suggested we plan a weekend getaway. But his efforts felt hollow, like a performance designed to distract me from the truth. And maybe that was unfair, maybe he was genuinely trying. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was all too little too late. One evening, after another day of stilted conversations and forced smiles, I found myself scrolling through old photos on my phone. There we were on our honeymoon, laughing as we stood knee-deep in the ocean. There we were at a friend's wedding, his arm around my waist, his smile bright and unguarded. There we were in the early days of our relationship, sitting on the couch in our tiny apartment, surrounded by pizza boxes and half-empty wine glasses, completely unaware of how complicated life would become. I stared at those photos for what felt like hours, searching for some clue, some sign that this was all a mistake, that the love we had was still buried somewhere beneath the rubble. But all I saw was a life that felt impossibly far away, like it belonged to someone else entirely. That night I couldn't stay in the house. The walls felt too close, the silence too suffocating. I grabbed my coat and walked aimlessly through the neighborhood, the chill in the air sharp against my skin. The streets were quiet, the faint glow of porch lights casting long shadows on the pavement. I passed houses filled with families, their laughter and warmth spilling out into the night, and felt a pang of envy so sharp it nearly brought me to my knees. Eventually, I found myself at a small diner on the edge of town, the kind of place where the coffee is always too strong and the booths are lined with cracked vinyl. I slid into a corner booth and ordered a cup of coffee, more for something to hold on to than to drink. The waitress didn't ask questions, just poured the coffee and left me to my thoughts. I don't know how long I sat there, staring at the swirling patterns in the coffee cup, my mind a jumble of what-ifs and maybes. But at some point I realized I wasn't alone. A woman had slipped into the booth across from me, her expression hesitant, almost apologetic. "Emily," she said, her voice soft but steady. It was Amanda. For a moment I couldn't speak. My throat tightened, and my hands gripped the edge of the table so hard my knuckles turned white. Of all the places, of all the times, why now? Why here? She looked different than I remembered. Her hair shorter, her face more lined, as though she'd aged years in the span of a few months. But her eyes were the same, sharp and piercing, watching me with a mix of curiosity and something else I couldn't quite place. "What are you doing here?" I finally managed to ask, my voice barely more than a whisper. She hesitated, her hands folded on the table in front of her. "I heard about what's been going on. I thought we should talk."
Ich starrte her, incredulous.
"Talk? About what? About how you ruined my marriage. About how you couldn't stay in the past where you belong." Her expression faltered, a flicker of guilt crossing her face. "I didn't mean for things to get this far," she said quietly. "I never wanted to hurt you." "Then why did you?" My voice cracked and I hated the way it made me sound weak, broken. "Why did you come back into his life? Why couldn't you just leave us alone?" She looked down at her hands, her shoulders slumping. "I don't know," she admitted. "When I reached out to Ryan, it wasn't supposed to be this. I was going through a rough time and he was a connection to something familiar, something safe. I didn't think about what it might do to you, to your marriage. And for that, I'm sorry."
Sorry.
I laughed bitterly. Sorry doesn't fix this. Sorry doesn't erase the doubt, the pain, the nights I've spent wondering if I'll ever be able to trust him again. "I know it doesn't," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I needed you to know that it wasn't about you. Or even about him, really. It was about me. About trying to hold on to something I didn't even realize I'd lost." Her words hung in the air, heavy and unsettling. Part of me wanted to believe her, to see her as a flawed human woman who had made a mistake. But the other part of me, the part that had spent months drowning in anger and betrayal, couldn't let go that easily. "I don't care what it was about," I said finally, my voice cold. "You didn't just hurt me. You hurt him. You hurt us. And no matter what you say, no matter how sorry you are, you don't get to walk away from this unscathed." She nodded, her expression solemn. "You're right. I don't. And I won't. I hope you and Ryan can find a way forward, whatever that looks like." I didn't respond. I couldn't. She slid out of the booth and left without another word, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the bitter taste of coffee gone cold. By the time I got home, the house was dark and silent. Ryan was already in bed, his breathing slow and even. I stood in the doorway for a long time watching him, wondering if he was dreaming of me or of a life he could never have again. wondering if I could ever look at him without seeing Amanda's shadow, wondering if the love we had was enough to survive what we'd become. I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that something had to change, because if it didn't, we'd both be swallowed whole by the wreckage of what we used to be. The days that followed Amanda's unexpected appearance at the diner were a blur of unresolved emotions. I couldn't shake the sound of her voice, the way she'd looked at me with an odd mix of guilt and vulnerability. Her words played on a loop in my head, as though she'd planted them there to torment me. It wasn't about you. It wasn't even about him. How could she say that? How could she so easily dismiss the destruction she'd left behind as collateral damage? She had walked into our lives like a storm, uninvited and unstoppable, and now she wanted to walk away, leaving me to pick up the pieces. I didn't want to forgive her. I didn't think I could. But I also couldn't ignore the seed of doubt she'd planted, the possibility that maybe she wasn't the sole villain in this story. Maybe the cracks had been there all along, and Amanda had simply widened them. That thought was almost harder to bear than the betrayal itself. If our marriage had already been flawed, what did that say about me? About us? About everything I had believed we were building together? Ryan seemed to sense the shift in me, though he didn't press me for details. He tiptoed around me like he was walking on glass, his every move careful and deliberate. He'd started cooking dinner more often, leaving little notes for me on the kitchen counter, doing anything he could to show he was trying. But his efforts felt hollow, like gestures meant to fill the space where trust used to live. And I hated myself for not being able to accept them. One night, as we sat across from each other at the dinner table, the silence between us was so thick it felt like another presence in the room. Ryan cleared his throat, his fork clinking against his plate as he set it down. "Emily," he said, his voice tentative, "I feel like we need to talk." I looked up from my barely touched meal, meeting his eyes for the first time in what felt like days. About what? About everything. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I recognized as his way of steadying himself. "I know things have been hard, and I know you don't trust me, but I don't know how to fix it if we can't talk to each other." I set my fork down, folding my hands in my lap to keep them from trembling. "What do you want me to say, Ryan? That I believe you? That I trust you? Because I don't know if I do. And I don't know if I can." His face fell, and for a moment, he looked so defeated that I almost regretted my words. But then a flicker of determination sparked in his eyes. "I don't expect you to fix this overnight," he said, leaning forward slightly. "But I need to know if you want to try. Because if you don't, if you've already made up your mind, then maybe we're just dragging this out for no reason." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I hadn't allowed myself to think about that possibility, the idea that there might be no way back from where we were. But now, sitting across from him, I realized he was right. We couldn't keep living like this, trapped in an endless cycle of doubt and resentment. Something had to give. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I can forgive you. I don't know if I can ever stop wondering. But I also don't know if I'm ready to give up." Ryan exhaled slowly, his shoulders relaxing just a fraction. "Then that's enough for me," he said quietly. "As long as you're willing to try, I'll do whatever it takes." It was a small step, but it felt monumental. For the first time in months, I allowed myself to hope just a little, that we might be able to find a way forward. But hope is a fragile thing, easily shattered. And I wasn't sure if ours could withstand the weight of everything we'd been through. We started spending more time together. Not out of obligation, but because it felt like we needed to remember who we were before everything fell apart. We went for long walks in the evenings, talking about anything and everything except Amanda. We cooked meals together, laughing over burn sauces and lopsided cakes. It wasn't perfect, far from it, but it was something. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I started to feel a glimmer of connection between us. But even as things improved, the shadow of Amanda lingered. Every time Ryan's phone buzzed, my stomach clenched. Every time he mentioned a work event or a meeting, I couldn't stop myself from wondering. The doubt was like a low hum in the background, always there, always threatening to drown out the progress we'd made. Then one day I found something I hadn't been looking for. I was cleaning out the closet in our bedroom, sorting through old boxes of clothes and keepsakes, when I stumbled across an envelope tucked into the back of a drawer. Inside was a stack of photos, the kind you get from an old-school photo booth. They were of Ryan and Amanda. The photos were innocent enough. Just the two of them laughing, making silly faces, her head resting on his shoulder in one of the frames. But it was the date written on the back that made my blood run cold. It was from 6 months ago. Well, after he'd promised me he had cut all ties with her. I stared at the photos, my hands shaking, my mind racing. This was it. This was the proof I had been waiting for or dreading. He had lied to me again. He had seen her again. And now all the progress we'd made felt like a cruel joke. A house of cards collapsing under the weight of yet another betrayal. When Ryan came home that evening, I was waiting for him in the living room, the photos laid out on the coffee table in front of me. He froze in the doorway when he saw them, his face going pale. "Emily," he began, his voice shaking. "I can explain." "Don't," I said, my voice cold and steady in a way that surprised even me. "I don't want your excuses. I don't want your lies. I just want to know one thing." "Why?" He looked at me, his eyes filled with something that might have been regret or fear or a mix of both. "It wasn't what you think," he said finally. "I ran into her by accident. We talked for a few minutes and that was it. I didn't tell you because I didn't want to hurt you." "You didn't want to hurt me?" I laughed bitterly, the sound harsh in the quiet room. "Do you have any idea what this feels like, Ryan? To keep finding out that you've lied to me over and over again? Do you even understand what you've done to us?" He didn't answer, and the silence stretched between us, heavy and suffocating. For the first time I realized that maybe he didn't understand. Maybe he never would. And maybe that was the problem. I stood up, my decision crystallizing in the stillness of that moment. "I can't do this anymore," I said, my voice breaking. "I can't keep living like this, wondering, doubting, waiting for the next lie to come to light. I deserve better than this. I deserve better than you." Ryan's face crumpled, and for a moment I thought he might cry. But he didn't argue, didn't beg me to stay. Maybe he knew it was pointless. Or maybe he knew I was right. I packed a bag that night, leaving behind the life we'd built together. It wasn't easy, nothing about this had been easy. But as I walked out the door, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: relief. The weight of doubt, of betrayal, of trying to fix something that was irreparably broken. It was gone. And in its place there was a quiet, fragile hope. Not for us, but for me. For a future that was mine alone to shape. In the weeks that followed, I discovered just how strange and disorienting it was to start over. The house, the routines, even the weather felt foreign without Ryan in the picture. At first, everything reminded me of him. The way the coffee tasted in the morning, a little too bitter without his steady hand adding just the right amount of cream. The empty side of the bed, cool and undisturbed, a stark reminder of the space he used to fill. Even the silence felt different, heavier somehow, like the house itself mourned his absence. But over time the ache softened just a little. It didn't disappear. I didn't expect it to. But it dulled around the edges, allowing me to breathe more freely. I kept busy, throwing myself into work, into hobbies I'd let fall by the wayside during my marriage. I started running again, pushing myself to exhaustion on the trail behind my apartment complex, letting the rhythm of my feet on the gravel drown out the noise in my head. It was a small thing, but it felt like reclaiming a piece of myself one step at a time. I didn't hear from Ryan in those first few weeks. Part of me had expected him to call, to plead with me to come back, to insist that we could make it work. But the phone stayed silent, and I was grateful for that. It gave me the space I needed to think, to begin untangling the mess of emotions that still lingered like a storm cloud in my mind. One afternoon I found myself walking through the old neighborhood, past the house Ryan and I had shared. It wasn't intentional. I hadn't planned to come this way, but my feet had a mind of their own, leading me back to a place that felt both familiar and foreign. The house looked the same from the outside, the front yard neatly trimmed, the porch swaying gently in the breeze. But it wasn't mine anymore, not really. It was just a shell, a place where a version of me used to live. I didn't linger long. There was no point in dwelling on what was gone. Instead, I walked to the park at the end of the street, the one where Ryan and I used to sit on lazy Sunday afternoons, watching the world go by. The bench we'd claimed as our own was still there, its wood worn smooth by time and weather. I sat down, the coolness of the seat seeping through my jeans, and let my thoughts wander. For the first time in what felt like forever, I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel sad either, not exactly. What I felt was something quieter. Something I couldn't quite name. Acceptance, maybe. Or something close to it. Ryan and I had shared a life. A love that had been real. Even if it hadn't been enough. And while the ending had been painful, it wasn't the whole story. There had been good moments too, moments that I could still hold on to without letting them define me. As the weeks turned into months, I started to rebuild. It wasn't easy, starting over never is, but it was necessary. I moved into a new apartment, smaller but cozy, with a balcony that overlooked the city. I filled it with plants and soft blankets and little touches that felt like me. Like a life I was beginning to recognize as my own. I made new friends, reconnecting with people I'd lost touch with during my marriage, and I let myself laugh again, really laugh in a way that felt free and unguarded. There were still hard days, of course. Days when the loneliness crept in, uninvited and unrelenting, making me question whether I'd made the right decision. On those days I let myself feel it, the sadness, the doubt, the grief for what had been, and then I let it pass. Because I knew deep down that staying would have been harder. Staying would have meant losing myself piece by piece, until there was nothing left. One evening, as I was sorting through old boxes I'd brought from the house, I stumbled across a photo album. It was one Ryan and I had put together in the early years of our marriage, back when everything felt new and full of promise. I hesitated before opening it, unsure if I was ready to face the memories contained within. But curiosity won out, and I flipped through the pages, my fingers tracing the edges of the photographs. There we were on our honeymoon, grinning like fools in front of the Eiffel Tower. There we were at a camping trip with friends, our faces smudged with soot from the fire. There we were on our first anniversary, sitting on the floor of our old apartment, surrounded by candles and takeout containers. Each photo told a story, a snapshot of a life that felt both distant and achingly familiar. When I reached the last page, I closed the album gently, letting out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. The photos didn't hurt as much as I'd expected them to. They didn't feel like a dagger twisting in my chest, or a reminder of everything I'd lost. Instead, they felt like a chapter in a book, one that had ended but still held meaning. Ryan had been a part of my story, an important one, but he wasn't the whole story. There was still so much ahead of me, so much I hadn't yet discovered. And for the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of peace, not because everything was perfect, but because I was learning how to move forward one step at a time. Months turned into a year, and life began to feel normal again, though a different kind of normal. I didn't hear from Ryan and I didn't reach out to him. There was nothing left to say. But one day, as I was walking through the park near my apartment, I saw a couple sitting on a bench, their heads close together, their laughter carried on the breeze. For a moment I felt a pang of something bittersweet, nostalgia maybe, or the faintest trace of longing. But it passed quickly, leaving behind only a quiet warmth.